It's December the 7th, 2004, and we are speaking with Tom Hobart. And Tom, you are the president of the New York State United Teachers. And, why don't you just give a little bit of your background to start out?
Well, in 1969, I was president of the Buffalo Teachers Federation, and in 1971, I was elected vice president of the New York State Teachers Association. I'm sorry, 1969, I was also elected vice president of the Teachers Association. In 71, I was elected president. And so I'm the last president of the New York State Teachers Association. And then in 1972, Al Shanker's United Teachers of New York and the New York State Teachers Association merged to form what was going to become NYSEC.
Do you remember when you first heard of an organization called CSEA?
Well, it was in 1969 because when we came together, all of the organizations came together to talk about, at that time, legislation. It was the only, didn't have, collective bargaining had just started in 1967. And so we were always trying to amend it. 69, they changed the Taylor Law. The Taylor Law was really the best law in the land when Rockefeller proposed it. It prohibited strikes, but there were no penalties if you struck. And CSEA's called for a strike in 1969 for all the state workers. And the legislature, there was a committee meeting to deal with what they call finality. Because there were impasses that were going on in collective bargaining and no way to settle them. And while that committee was meeting to have recommendations, there was an emergency meeting of the leaders in the legislature, and the penalties were put into the Taylor Law, the 2-for-1 penalty, the judge being able to issue an injunction against the strike, and the 2-for-1 penalty. There was one other put in, but it was put in specifically to stop the CSEA strike possibility in 1969. So, you know, Ted Wenzel and I used to meet from time to time over issues of common concern.
Okay, and was the relationship cordial at that time?
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh yes, very very much so. Ted was opposed to the AFLCIO, so were we at that time, you know, until we got to 1972 when we joined it. 1972, he would rib me quite a bit about joining the AFLCIO, George Meany telling me what to do, which, by the way, I looked forward to, but George never bothered to call and tell me what to do.
What do you remember about those early years under the Taylor Law? I mean, obviously you had kind of this new law. It provided some protections. It had some limitations, but largely there were a lot of unprecedented situations, I would imagine, that you were dealing with.
Well, the first thing, the school administration was unprepared for the Taylor Law coming through. The state was somewhat better prepared because, you know, Rockefeller, when he passed the law, set up some way to implement it and immediately covered all the state employees. But as is probably the only way you could do it, the collective bargaining rights were given to the employer and the individual employees. So the 700, at that time there were 800 school districts, so there were going to be 800 individual employers that were out there. And each unit had to be organized. And under the law, we were allowed either to have a collective bargaining election or to have stipulation if we had a majority of the members. So from our side, and I'm not sure exactly how CSEA did it, but the teachers, you know, we simply marched in the superintendent's office and we said, the law says that if we have a majority of the members, you must recognize us. And the superintendent would say, well, if the law says, and we would put another notch in our belt and we would go out as great organizers. Later on, when we started organizing healthcare, we found out really what organizing was all about. We didn't have any employers saying, well, if the law says. The first agreements, Shanker had negotiated a contract in about 1965, and there were a number of agreements that were in the state. Springville Academy, which is a city south of Buffalo, had collective bargaining. The president of their Board of Education had been the president of the Central Labor Council. And so he gave them collective bargaining sometime in the early 60s. And there were a few like that. Wantauk on Long Island, for some reason, had a collective bargaining agreement. Reminds me of Texas, in that state where there's an anti-conspiracy law. Corpus Christi has collective bargaining because the president of the seafarers was president of the Board of Education, and he gave them collective bargaining rights. So Rochester struck to get collective bargaining rights in 1965, and Buffalo, we were able to get the collective bargaining rights in 1969, which went into effect in June. The Taylor Law went into effect in September. So we have some history before the Taylor Law went into effect of people bargaining. And what the New York State Teachers Association did was they hired a Kay Schuler New York City law firm to come to Buffalo to negotiate our contract because we won the collective bargaining election. And somebody said, well, what do we do now? And I can remember saying, geez, I don't know. I don't know what we do now. So Kay Schuler came in and put together a comprehensive contract that was accepted by the Board of Education in August of that year. And then when the Taylor Law went into effect in September 1st, we simply, New York State Teachers Association simply took that contract from Buffalo and applied it to all the other school districts in the state. And so it really was like a model that most people picked up. There were very little problems in that first year, 1967. But then we started in 68, 69, 70, 71, probably up to 74. All of the strikes we had in the state, we had 101 of our members that went to jail. And we have a honor roll to those 101, and we give them a pin called In Defense of Teacher Rights. It's a little half moon with bars on it. And at our convention this year, we will have 2 of those people still left. Stanley Rosengarten and Sylvia Matusek are still active in the organization, and they went to jail in the early 70s. And jailing, if you talk about difficulties, in Yorktown Heights, which is north of New York City, when they went to jail, the vindictive board identified the husband and wife teaching teams and put the wives in jail, not the husbands, which was a very traumatic thing for the men, to watch their wife go off to jail. In Schenectady, when they went to jail, there was no women's facility in Schenectady County. They sent the women to the Albany women's facility, which was pretty much prostitutes and people who were accused of murder and all that. And so here were these middle-aged school teachers that had to go through internal searches to enter the facility. So it was a pretty difficult period of time. Once the school boards caught on that they had a power, and some of them used that, but it was not effective because we continued to have strikes, and we continued to have one 2 years ago in Yonkers. So the law has worked for us. Not that we don't want to change it and make it better, but it has worked.
Sure. Back in those early days, were the teachers interested in organizing the non-instructional employees? Was there a tension with some of the CSEA units?
Well, they were, I don't remember when CSEA actually got active and organized, probably about the same time we did, but when we had the merger in 1972, Al Shanker had just brought the paraprofessionals into the UFT in New York City. And he had talked about then we should be bringing the paraprofessionals into NYSET. Now, we didn't have any paraprofessionals. We had some teaching assistants. But at that time, New York and Buffalo were their own certifying agents. So they had set up their own, those 2 districts had set up their own standards. when we started off, there was an awful lot out there, so we didn't bump into each other, and we were kind of doing our own thing. And it wasn't until later on that we've come up, and now we have the very difficult problem that the Newberg case has brought up, that if they change the classification to the teacher assistant, a lot of our recognition clauses give the certified personnel to us automatically. And I mean, it's not our intent to disrupt CSEA locals, and we're trying to figure out how to work through that at this point.
Mm-hmm. But I would imagine that at one time, I mean, when you were an AFLCIO union and CSEA was an unaffiliated union in the mid-'70s, that there must have been some tension in some of the school districts over who was going to represent what units.
Well, SEIU was very active in trying to challenge CSEA, which it contained both the support personnel and the scientific, professional, and technical units. And we got involved in the early '70s with SEIU in order to try to have a collective bargaining election over there. The reason was from George Hardy was president of SEIU, and Al Shanker, who was not yet president of the AFT, was president of the city, but they wanted to bring the group into the AFLCIO, and Ted Wenzel was absolutely opposed to that at all. So that was the genesis of the elections. There were, I think it was '74, I'm not sure how long the contract was, but the period before PEF was organized, we had lost the election and lost it significantly. And it was Shanker and my feeling that that was the last crack we were going to take at it, because we were not getting anywhere. Hardy came to us in '75 and said that they had new polls, and it showed that there was a great deal of unrest, and we should move ahead. And we had a two-campaign strategy, and we were going to have the first year, and then when the second window opened, we would have a second campaign. But we would put together the infrastructure that was needed, because we had determined from the last loss that we just had no infrastructure, and CSEA had one, which I don't think was extremely effective under Ted Wenzel, but at least was there. We had nobody. CSEA had somebody at every work site. We did not. And so our strategy was this two-pronged approach. The first election would be to put together the structure, and then when the window opened again, we would have a structure in place to go after the unit. But we won the first time around. And so PEF was born with the Scientific, Professional, and Technical Unit. And immediately we decided that we were going to go after the support personnel then. And until I got a phone call one night saying that there was a meeting of the executive board and they just affiliated with AFSCME. And so Article 20 prevented any further movement on that. So we had put it together. In fact, it was such a loose organization that PERB had to define PEF, who PEF was. And the definition came down that PEF was Johnny Gogan, I think was the name of the general organizer for SEIU, and Vito DeLeonardis, who was our executive director. They said that was PEF. In other words, these two guys owned a 60,000 member bargaining unit, and because we had nobody else. And then it was like a race to try to put together a democratic structure, because both Hardy and Shanker had said, you can't own a union. That's corruption. And so we got to figure out how to give it away, and that's how PEF was born.
Then it was basically like a hybrid of the teachers and the SEIU.
Yeah. The first staff of PEF was all our managers. We hired unit people as the field reps, and but it was all our managers that went over there to set up PEF.
Yeah, good. Tell me a little bit more about your relationship with Ted Wenzel. We unfortunately have not had the opportunity to interview him prior to his passing, and I'd like to know a little bit more about the man and what made him tick.
Well, Ted was out of the association model. We had a guy just like Ted, G. Howard Gould. He had been executive secretary for 19 years. They were very high moral characters, and everything they did was based on morality and not on the workers' rights. They would say, well, no, the state has this prerogative. We can't challenge that. And Ted was that. He was a very distinguished-looking gentleman. He was a member of the Fort Orange Club. Which, when I joined the Fort Orange Club, I was wondering whether I would get in as a union person, and I live in Buffalo, so that's why I live in the Fort Orange Club. I have a room there, and they said, no, you're going to be in, because we've had a union guy. We've had Ted Wenzel. And I said, Jesus, don't ever tell Ted that he was a union guy, because he would have been very upset about that. That's why we were so upset about the penalties in the Taylor Law, because Ted was not going to lead CSEA out on strike. There was no possibility of him going out on strike, and this commission that was dealing with finality was actually going in the other direction. How are we going to, when a school board is in transient, how are we going to move them off of that? And instead of that, we got these draconian penalties that came in. But there was a good feeling in the state. I remember in my church, St. Gregory's in suburban Buffalo, the pastor wanted us to pray against the sin that CSEA was going to perpetrate upon the people of the state of New York, which I started up to give an alternate opinion, and my wife, we had a big argument over that in the church that day. But there was this feeling.
What was he specifically referring to?
Well, the CSEA had taken a strike vote, and he was saying that state workers can't go on strike. That would be a sin. Of course, my members have been striking for a year or two, since then. The UFT had been striking in 1960. The Buffalo Teachers Federation went on strike in 1946. I mean, here's this guy, doesn't even know what's going on, talking about it's going to be a sin if anybody goes out to work.
I take it this was probably what we call the Easter Sunday strike?
Yeah, probably that was when it was. But it was it was the structure that Ted had put in place, but it was very similar to the structure that the New York State Teachers Association had in place. And the New York State Teachers Association, the first time I went on their board in 1960, it must have been in 66, they were bragging how they'd been able to hold up the passage of what was going to be called the Taylor Law, because the legislature had met all the demands except they refused to change the name from collective bargaining to professional negotiations. So that gives you some idea what these people were. I mean, we're hung up on a name, and here I'm out in Buffalo, and we're starving to death out there because of the tactics of the board without collective bargaining, and this guy doesn't like the name collective bargaining, wants to hold it up. And I'm sure, from what I know about Ted, that Ted must have been with G. Howard Gould on that. They must have, thought that was a fine idea. And so when the modern CSEA and NYSET, when we came in, there was a whole different attitude about members' rights. And I think, for Ted, he never thought he'd lose the election. That's why we had all these lawsuits that were on. I told you about Featherstone Hoff before we started filming, where he said that I was going to put his kids through college, all the suits in order to settle whether the unit had actually beat Ted or not. So it was quite a period of time.
Now, the next president of CSEA was Bill McGowan. What kind of relationship did you have with him?
Well, I think he was from the West Seneca facility of CSEA, and so I live, that's a southern suburb of Buffalo, and I live in a northern suburb of Buffalo, so Bill and I traveled together a lot coming into Albany, where the headquarters of the two organizations were. And except for wondering why he never lit a cigar, I mean, which he chewed on all the time, we had a very good relationship during that period of time. As I said, Article 20 had eliminated any talk of any other challenges we had, so we didn't have any conflicts between us. And we were amicable. We worked together on some legislation that was out there through the AFLCIO, and we were both very proud of our organizations, and we told each other a lot of stories about the good times. I don't think we ever told each other about any failures we had, but we kind of kept that close to the vest.
Initially, CSEA was not part of the AFL-CIO, the New York State AFL-CIO, but I think it was at the very end of McGowan's era that he did have CSEA affiliate. Do you remember what that was like in the AFL when CSEA came on board in the New York State AFL-CIO?
Well, just before CSEA came in, we were paying a substantial amount of the total per cap for both the state and every central labor council in the state. And when I say substantial, I'm talking 60–70% of some labor councils, and probably over 50% of what the state Fed was getting in revenue. Shanker was very committed to the AFL-CIO. He said we could make a change on it. We only could make a change from the inside. So we were, it was not much of an operation. Ray Corbett ran it out of the steelworkers office or ironworkers office in New York City on 14th Street. And it was a very small staff. There were 3 or 4 people in New York City in Ray's office, and there was probably 4 or 5 up here. The major one was Cy Cohen, who was the director of political action, and there wasn't very much political action. All of the contributions came out of dues money, so most of the contributions were like $100, and not done by any body that would look over who should get it. It was like, well, you know, that Central Labor Council president is affiliating a couple hundred of his members, and so give him $100 for the candidate that he wants. And so when CSEA came in, I would say that was the beginning of the modernizing of what was going to become the AFL-CIO, because then there were 2 strong bodies that were in there. It wasn't just us. And it was very difficult. The first convention we went to, was at the Concord, and when you register at the convention, they have tables and they have signs up, A to D, E to G, and all that down the side there. And the first convention, they had a table on one side with those signs up that said teachers, and on the other side, they had one that said all others. So, even though we tried to softly land in the labor movement, there was a lot of resentment at that time we had our own table. And obviously we didn't need our own table. I mean, we were entitled to I don't know, 1,000 delegates, but we had like 22 delegates, and I had to tell people, those yellow school buses, if I need them, you'll see them coming down the driveway in the Concord, but they have to stay there and teach school until I need them. And so CSEA coming in made a whole change. Up to that point, the building trades absolutely ran the AFL-CIO. I remember when we endorsed Hugh Carey over Malcolm Wilson in the Building Trade Council meeting. Somebody asked, how was it possible, since you need a 2/3 vote to endorse somebody, if the building trades was opposed to him, how was it possible that somebody could get endorsed? And the answer was, well, teachers are here, and they've got 2/3 of the votes. And it's fortunate that they believe that, because I don't think those yellow buses would have been coming down the driveway with the people that would have put their hand up. And And then after that one, that must have been the time that Bill had brought in CSEA. Then it started to build. Ed Cleary came on. There was the ability to then tell Ray Corbett that he'd served us well, but that it was time for somebody new. And then Ed Cleary put together a real operation for the AFL-CIO.
But between CSEA,
Excuse me.
the changing role of the AFL-CIO when CSEA joined with NYSUT, I mean, I would guess that really kind of shifted the power in the AFL-CIO towards the public employee union side.
Well, we talked about that a lot. Today, CSEA and NYSUT have more than a majority. But if Danny and I flaunt that, the other people just stop paying dues. So you've got to soft shoe this a little bit to keep them in. When the United Auto Workers started to throw their weight around in Michigan, the building trades withdrew from the Michigan AFL-CIO. And you always keep that in front of you. It would be very difficult to get a public employee as president of the AFL-CIO. It would be very difficult to get somebody other than a building trades person, even though we have the votes. Whenever Dennis Hughes, the president of the New York State AFL-CIO, has a high-level meeting, no matter what the topic is, Danny and I are there. And the other characters change depending on the topic. But Dennis is aware of the support that he gets from these two organizations. But again, the AFL-CIO was founded by the private sector unions, and they think they're still paying for it, and they're not.
Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about your relationship with Joe McDermott. Obviously, a very different personality from Bill McGowan.
Well, Joe was out of the Buffalo area too, so I saw him coming back and forth. But with Bill, it was more that that's when we got everything started, and so we had a very cordial relationship, but we didn't have the same kind of a relationship that I had before. And I think most of it was just we both got busier. In the early days, there wasn't a lot to do. I mean, but you were putting things together. There was big gaps between the time that something would happen at the state ed department, something would happen at the legislature, or a local called you to go out and talk at a strike rally. And then things just got busier, and so we had a good relationship, but it wasn't the same as. And I'm trying to remember. I don't think he smoked cigars. I remember Bill did. So.
I think he did smoke cigarettes at one time.
Yeah.
But, and obviously then Danny. I know Danny Donahue has worked very closely with you on a lot of projects.
Yeah.
over the
Well.
years.
Yeah, we started when Danny was on Long Island, as a vice president, and yeah, we've had a very good relationship, and he's been terrific. When I call him about donating to the Labor Religion Coalition, he's always right there, and I try to respond on the Coalition for Black Trade Unions and make sure that CSEA really started that. When that goes, that we give support to that group and to Portia Gibbons and everything that she's doing.
As you look back over the last 25 to 30 years, what do you think are the most significant activities and events that CSEA and NYSUT works jointly on?
25 years. Back into the 80s that we worked together on. Well, the most significant is how to restructure the central labor councils. Danny and I have been banging our heads against the wall on this structure. I mean, the amount of money that's going into the central labor councils, or the ELFs today, and the benefit that is coming out of it for any working people. I would say that if if we saw some great success coming out for one of the other trades or one of the other unions, that would be a reason to join and contribute to it. But the Central Labor Councils don't appear to be providing anything. The exception might be New York City or Rochester, but it's just when at one point when we started to increase the funding, we found out that the Genesee Central Labor Council was defunct, but we'd been sending money there for about 15 years, and the last president had been cashing the checks that we've been sending in. So Danny and I have worked very hard on the new alliance to make sure that that got structured correctly. Then it got accepted from people throughout the state. We went around the state with Dennis Hughes to try to make sure that we would have support for that. And we've worked together on legislation on school bus drivers and things that have occurred, like where we have a joint interest in the members. And we worked together on political campaigns that we've had. And I guess up until this November, we were patting each other on the back for how successful we've been. And well, I guess we go back to '72. We have to alibi what happened with Pataki, but we've had an awful lot of wins with that.
As you look at CSEA as somebody who has some relationship, but largely an outsider to the organization, what do you think it is about CSEA that makes it work, and why it's been around for close to 100 years?
I've had very visible presidents. Our fight with the NEA is that they want term limits, and we just throw our hands up in the air. We can't understand what the hell they're talking about. They claim they got 2.2 million members that all could be president, and my response at one of our merger discussions was no difference between Churchill or Gandhi or Roosevelt. I mean, those are just ordinary Americans. Somebody else could have gone there and done that, and they say yes. So CSEA has not been saddled with something like that. You've had, substantial leadership that have great visibility throughout the state, and I think that's been a very a strong point you have. The size of the membership is a very good point. I mean, you can have a great union that is small and you don't have the resources to do a lot of the things you want, and because of the resources, you wouldn't get them unless there was a commitment of the members to the organization. And so I think those three things are the reason why you've had so much success for the workers in the state.
I mean, I always want to go back and think about that we've worked together on with the COLA thing.
Are there any other things that come to mind in terms of major joint activities between CSEA and NYSU?
Well, when we had the COLA rally here, we were trying to get an escalator for our retired members, and we brought it together. It was primarily NYSU and CSEA, which did all the planning, brought all the members, and achieved the victory. And in the beginning, Danny and I didn't know we were going to have a victory. Had all these people there, and what do you tell them, the next year if you don't get it? And then I guess the legislators started looking out their windows and seeing the rally, and all of a sudden everybody came down and wanted to talk, and everybody that talked said how we should have a COLA, and that really was a terrific move. And to try to figure out the value to our members on that, well, I don't want to figure it out because I don't want anybody to know what it is, but you figure every retiree got an increase in their benefits, and every retiree in the future is going to get an increase in their benefits. So while we're somewhat hesitant to crow about the exact dollar amount that went into that for the effects it might have on other legislation that we need, that was just a monumental success that we had and that we had planned jointly together. The May 3rd rally for the veto overrides, You know, we were involved in an override in '79, which said that New York City could not spend less than it had spent the year before, because it had gotten a lot of state aid, and state aid for education was all going into roads and bridges and other things in the city and not into the schools. And we passed the legislation, and then it was vetoed by Governor Carey. And so I know what we went through in order to line up the legislators in order to make that a possibility. When we came into the massive vetoes that Pataki had given us, and we were talking about an override, it seemed like well, it was a good membership building thing, but to achieve that again, you know, how we're ever going to do that. And then, of course, the members of CSEA, first the planning that we planned to get, well, I guess first the agreement to say, let's do this together. And then the members that turned out, and then the final success. I told you at McGowan we always talked about successes. I'm not going to tell you about the things that we tried to do together that didn't come out as well, but I think those two examples of working together justifies all the ones that didn't come out as well as we wanted.
Sure. Great. Well, Tom, thank you.
Okay,
Appreciate
thank
it.
you.